Today we're actually going to practice finding the vertex of a graph and even figuring out what the vertex of a graph is. And then also using the vertex of the graph, we're going to find the axis of symmetry. So when we're looking at a graph, first thing we need to know is what is the vertex and what is the axis of symmetry. So if I look at this point, right where the graph turns and changes directions, that's called the vertex of the graph. So the graph, wherever it changes direction, is called the vertex. And then the axis of symmetry actually goes directly through the vertex, and it cuts the parabola symmetrically in half. So when we're looking at the axis of symmetry, it's always going to be an x equals value. So it's going to always say x equals. You might remember an axis has an x in it, so it's always going to be an x equals equation. And what it's going to be is the x value of our vertex. So the x value of my vertex is going to be my axis of symmetry. So we are going to use the calculator to do all of this work. So if we go to number 1, you're going to put this equation into the y equals of your calculator. And the very first thing you're going to do is graph it. And when you graph it, we're going to use our calculator in order to locate the vertex. So in order to do this, the most important thing you'll have to remember when you are doing this is that for the calculator to be able to calculate the vertex, it's going to have to see the vertex on the screen. So when you put number 1 into your calculator and you press graph, you'll notice that the vertex is way down below the bottom of the screen. So you're going to have to zoom out. So press zoom out and press your enter key so that it will zoom out, so that you can actually see your vertex. Then we're going to use the calculate button on the calculator in order to calculate our vertex. So looking at this vertex, it's a sketch, looks something kind of like this. When we look at our vertex is down there at the bottom of the graph where it turns and changes directions. There's 2 words you need to know. There's minimum vertex and maximum vertex. So this vertex is actually at the very bottom of my graph. It's the very smallest part of my graph. So it's actually called a minimum because we're talking about the vertex being at the very bottom of the graph or the smallest value. So we need that for the calculator. So we're going to say second calculate, and we've determined that it's a minimum, so we're going to go to number 3. And this is where it's asking you to put your cursor on the left side of the vertex. So using your arrow keys, find your cursor. That's the little flashy thing on your graph, and place it on the left side of your vertex, anywhere on the left side, and press enter. Then you use your right arrow key to put the cursor on the right side of the vertex, and you press enter. Then you'll press enter past the word guess, and it tells us that our vertex is 5, -23. So I've now figured out using my calculator the vertex. But the second thing it wants us to find is our axis of symmetry. So the line that's going straight up and down, straight through my vertex. So axis of symmetry has an x in it, so it's going to be x equals, and we're just going to use the x value of our vertex, and that's our axis of symmetry. So I'm going to just write axis of symmetry. So as long as you have your calculator, you'll be able to find the vertex and the axis of symmetry very easily. Now, on number 5, it's given us a graph, and it's wanting us to find the domain and the range. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and put number 5 into the calculator. So we're going to go back to our y equals, and we're going to put in 3x squared plus 6x plus 2, and we're going to graph it in our calculator. And then I'm going to go ahead and just make a quick sketch of it here on the notes so that I can see what I'm talking about. So if I make a quick sketch of it, it looks like my graph goes about right here, and about right here. And then I'm going to need to figure out what my vertex is. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do second calculate, and it's a minimum. So I'm going to say second calculate minimum. I'm going to put my cursor on the left and press enter. Move my cursor to the right and press enter. And it tells me that my vertex is -1, 1. So I know that my vertex is right here at -1, 1. So now I can go ahead and sketch my graph. Okay, so now that we've got our vertex, we know that our axis of symmetry is right here at the x equals -1. So my vertex is -1, 1. My axis of symmetry is x equals -1. And then it's asking for my domain and my range. So, domain, Dolar the robot. Domain is read left to right. And the really cool thing about domain on a quadratic, it's always the same. Because if we look and try and put a left boundary, we've got arrows right here. So we can't put a left boundary, and we can't put a right boundary because of these arrows. So our domain is always going to be all real numbers. So the domain on my parabola is always all real numbers. So the only thing I really have to worry about is the range. And the range, I'm going to use the y value of my vertex. So I'm going to put my pen on the vertex. And my question I have to myself is my graph above my point or above my vertex, or is my graph below my vertex? Well, I can look and see that it's above, so my range is going to be y, which is the range, is greater than or equal to, that's above, and my y value of my vertex is -1. Looks like I didn't put a negative in there. Okay, so my range is y is greater than or equal to -1. Okay, let's turn the page. The other thing that you will be tested on is whether a graph opens upward or opens downward. And the best way to remember this is to look at the arrows. So when you have a graph, this one's got arrows. They're pointing the way it opens. So this one opens downward. And this other one, we look at our arrows, and it's opening upward. So when you're looking at the calculator, it doesn't put arrows. You just kind of mentally draw them in, so you'll know if it opens upward or downward. So the last thing we need to do then is just determine if these open upward or downward, and if it's a minimum or a maximum. So number 8, I'm going to put into the y equals key. So I'm putting 8x squared plus 16x minus 2, and I'm going to graph it. And I'm going to sketch my graph right here. Looks like it kind of does this sort of thing. Okay, so is this one opening up or is it opening down? Well, my arrows right here are pointing up, so I know that this one opens up. And then the other question is my vertex. Is my vertex a minimum or a maximum? And what that has to do with is my vertex at the very bottom or the smallest point of my graph, or is it at the largest? Well, if I look, this is at the very bottom. It's a minimum. So this is a minimum graph. Okay, now let's look at number 9. So I'm going to put number 9 into my y equals key. So I've got negative x squared minus 4x minus 7. And I'm going to graph it. I'm just going to sketch my graph right here. So this one's actually kind of doing this little thing. So if I look at my arrows, my little arrows are saying this thing is opening down. And then I need to look at my vertex. So my vertex is the point where the graph changes direction. And if I look at this vertex on this graph, it's the very biggest number that my graph is going to have. It's at the very top of my graph. So that makes this a maximum. Okay, so if you have any other questions, feel free to come into tutorials and get them answered.